Hi, and welcome to another episode of NXIVM on Trial, what I guess you might call the season finale. I am Casey Seiler, editor-in-chief of the Albany Times-Union. Happy to be joined once again by our podcast regulars, including
Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
Rob Gavin, the Times-Union's Cops and Courts reporter, and I covered the NXIVM trial.
And we could not be more pleased to welcome a special guest, actually the first of this series of NXIVM on Trial, and that is Moira Penza, partner at Wilkinson Steckloff, and of course, the former assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District and the lead prosecutor in the prosecution of Keith Raniere. Moira, thanks so much for doing this. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get right into it. Moira, just a couple of questions for you. What has it been like watching this season of HBO's The Vow, that of course we've been talking about for the last 5 weeks, since this series of episodes has largely been built around the prosecution that you, with your team, kind of structured and executed? I mean, I don't think it's going too far to say that you, in part, scripted this season of The Vow.
You know, it's been very surreal, is really the only way to describe it, especially because a lot of the filming that I did for The Vow was quite a while ago. I'd say a lot of it I filmed in January 2020. So really to be reliving a lot of it is just a truly fascinating experience. I think one of the other things that is very interesting is that, of course, these are very talented storytellers. And as a trial attorney, telling a story is what I do. And I really tried to construct a narrative through the trial in terms of choosing what our witness order was, which exhibits we were going to focus on, how it was going to play out. And so as somebody who also, I would say I probably am I don't want to say controlling, but I do like to be in control. And so I think having somebody else telling the story of this trial is something that occasionally can be difficult, even though I do think on the whole it was an important season. And I think that there are many ways in which they did a fantastic job. But there's always more to tell. You know, these witnesses were on the stand for days. There were tons of exhibits. I know exactly why I did certain things. Sometimes there's tension that's built into the show that I don't really think was tension at trial, for example. So all of those things are very interesting. And I will say, one of the reasons that I have appreciated your podcast is I think, Rob was there living it every day too. And so I think sometimes my exact thought will, pop up in the podcast, which I've appreciated.
Was it interesting for you to hear the in media res, I think is the artistic term, commentary from, your adversary in this prosecution, Mark Agnifilo, and hearing sort of, as it were, how his barometer of confidence kind of went up and down probably more than it ever went up over the course of the trial?
I'm not really that surprised because I think the level of confidence he had, or at least as it appears in The Vow at the beginning, I think is, I always thought maybe it would be kind of a show, but I actually think watching him on The Vow, it's really hard to tell how much of it he had bought into, how much as an attorney you just need to, fully invest in the case that you're doing. So I think there were things that he said that were actually surprising to me. I certainly thought, he's a very talented defense attorney. If you're in New York and you're looking for a criminal defense attorney, he is going to be one of the names, and his colleague, Ben Brafman, who was really his mentor. That's, those are kind of some of the biggest names in the criminal defense bar in New York. I had actually done another case with Mark Agnifilo, where he was representing a dentist in New York who had actually been distributing child pornography and exchanging meth for dental services. So it was kind of an interesting that this was the next case that I had with him. So, I think he has to take his client as he finds him. But I thought there were moments where it felt like he had bought into Keith Raniere's narrative more than I actually think I appreciated during the trial. I also think, this was something that I think I noted throughout the series, but every time there was, what I would say either salacious evidence or evidence of Keith being, quote, a bad man, that was always directly relevant to the charges at play, directly relevant to, for example, showing the means and methods of the enterprise, to showing how there was coercive control. And so I think he was very dismissive of that, at least in the Val footage. But even after the trial, it was kind of interesting in last night's episode to see Mark Agnifilo still saying NXIVM is good. And, there is, under the ethical rules, you do have obligations to your client really forever. Like, you can't go out and disparage your former client, but you certainly don't have to embrace what they were selling.
Did you buy Mark Agnifilo's kind of argument near the end of sort of what he told Raniere, I think probably as he was getting close to the verdict, which was, well, there was an argument to be made about NXIVM and about the things you did, but once the sexual abuse of a minor and child pornography is introduced into that equation, the conversation is pretty much over.
I do think a case that includes allegations of child exploitation and where you actually have images of child pornography, that is a difficult case to defend against. But I don't think here that I don't think that the case against him was not strong before that. I mean, I think that you have to remember all of those allegations, not only about Das, but about the trafficking of Daniela being in the room. Also, a lot of additional, what I would call smaller charges, but that were also very much part and parcel of the enterprise, were all fairly clear. I mean, it was pretty easy to prove up certain of those charges, to prove up the elements of those predicate acts otherwise. So I think that that's something it's interesting to hear said. And of course, as a prosecutor who has dealt in cases involving children, I think that is something that is very difficult for a jury to listen to. But I also think one of the reasons it becomes a really hard case to win is because there's concrete evidence of abuse. So a lot of times when you think about any sort of sex crime, and a lot of things happen behind closed doors, and a lot of people don't fully understand victim behavior, and that can be confusing to people and to juries. But when you have pictures of an underage minor, it's really hard to. That's a charge that is pretty clear cut.
I'm sure you would be loath to kind of question the decisions of any other U.S. attorney's office, but how do you explain the fact that the prosecution was brought in the Eastern District, which is, Brooklyn and Long Island, and not the district where these crimes occurred almost exclusively?
It is, as you say, it's very difficult for me to explain how other districts didn't, or not even other districts, right? Clearly the Northern District of New York, but also local district attorneys' offices. I think that there was jurisdiction there for a long time. But I will say, when this case received initial media attention, when I read about it in the New York Times, I did have the benefit of being at a very sophisticated office where we do have the resources, where we did have the relationship with the FBI, where they were willing to immediately get involved, interviewing tons of witnesses right away. And I think it was a team that really did have an open mind and wanted to investigate this. And I think there may have actually been a benefit to the fact that being outside of the Albany area, we hadn't heard about this before. So it wasn't as if, oh, NXIVM is off doing something out its latest antics. Like, this was really shocking, a really shocking account. And then the fact of us having jurisdiction was very clear right away, because so many of our victims were being recruited from Brooklyn or Queens, or were taking flights into the airports in Queens to travel then afterwards to Albany, all of which gives you that venue hook that you need to bring a federal prosecution. So I think it's really concerning that this was not looked into by law enforcement sooner, because I think a lot of additional people were hurt because of that.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. I have one more question, and I do want to open it up to talk about the series finale of The Vow. But what do you think the future holds for kind of the NXIVM dead enders like Nikki Klein?
Again, it's really, I think, hard for me to say. I think the level of cognitive dissonance is so high among that group. They just devoted their life to this and now have doubled down. And I think it's very difficult for them to extricate themselves at this point. I don't have a ton of sympathy. I think there may have been a point in time where I did, at least for some members of that. But now I just think the facts are so clear. I think that, they really sound like, members of the Flat Earth Society. It's all this conspiracy theory nonsense. They never confront the fact of, did he act, whatever else you want to say about the trial or anything else, do you believe he actually did have sex with a bunch of minors and you still want to continue to support him publicly? So it's difficult at this point for me to have a ton of sympathy for them. I also think that, in some disturbing ways, it certainly seems as if Nikki Klein has kind of taken on a leadership role within that small group that remains. But I also think that with Keith Raniere gone, it also seems pretty clear that it's not going to expand beyond them. So I think it is sad, but I don't think it poses a danger for society as a whole. Also, when I left the office at that, which I left in September after the trial was in June. So I didn't have any role in additional decisions of who to prosecute. And I will say, I think once Keith Raniere was convicted, I do think a lot of the danger going forward to society was gone at that point. So, I don't know everything that went into decisions about who else to prosecute or not prosecute. But certainly I think the fact of Nikki Klein's fraudulent marriage to Allison Mack and her, continuing to be in this country based on that illegal marriage is something that I think is interesting and something that you don't hear her talking about.
I thought what's interesting is that there is so much talk, even last night, about the evidence involving child pornography. But really, I think the most damning evidence against Keith Raniere is Keith Raniere. It's his own words and emails, his comments, his ego. There's evidence in the form of child pornography that's entered into evidence, but then there's also his emails. And his emails to me are damning. You have him and you have Camilla referring to, I don't know if they showed this last night, but there was the, you have been my quote, or he says, it's honored to be your quote unquote husband of like 8.75 years. And if you do the math, it goes back to 45 and 15. You have her emails, and then you add that with what we know already came out as far as him and Nancy parroting his words about quote unquote adult like children and age of consent and being 12. I have no idea where in the world the age of consent is 12. That's just all part of the overwhelming case that jurors heard about Keith Raniere. So before you even get to the evidence about the actual child pornography, there's a huge amount of, I think, really, really incriminating stuff there. And if you look at it, the people that are trying to say he's innocent, this is a frame job or whatever, I mean, there's always that, well, how do you get past Camilla, for starters, saying he did it, and also her messages then? And this wasn't part of the case necessarily, obviously, but the Times Union's 2012 Secrets of NXIVM, where you have a history of this. And Nancy Salzman, she had to be aware of that. So that's always the part of this I look at, like, don't act like you're coming in at a left field. You had no idea. You were reciting comments that, regardless of the context, and I thought she did try to hide from it a little bit by saying it's out of context. I don't know if there's any context that one could make those comments about children being perfectly happy having sex with adults where it's not incredibly disturbing. So I don't know what taken out of context there in her point of view, but she had to know going in that this was not the furthest thing from a reality.
I completely agree with you, Rob. I think that the evidence was overwhelming that he had a sexual contact and sexually abused Camilla since she was 15. Long before I had met Camilla, I was able to figure out that date, the exact date that she then later said in her victim impact statement, purely from those emails that you're talking about, let alone there were also medical records. And then there was all this evidence that we couldn't even put in at trial, including her own journals that she had written. And I do think the evidence of his prior abuse of minors, now, if you're talking about the people who are still loyal to Keith Raniere, there's no reason why they shouldn't be considering that. That was something we weren't allowed to put in at trial because Judge Garifas ruled that it was overly prejudicial to proving up these charges. We wanted to say, look, this is the exact same pattern. Even back in the CBI days, you see Pam Kafritz grooming an underage girl. You see that he's targeting somebody who, the daughter of somebody who works for him, who he has access to, all of those things. I think ultimately Judge Garifas made a smart decision there in terms of that ruling. But again, these are the things that, if you were paying attention at all, are impossible to ignore.
I also thought it was interesting, and Moira, you'll be familiar with this, that we were talking about Mark Agnefilo's comments, and he was in, obviously, he took the job to be Keith Raniere's attorney, but some of the comments he made during his closing argument, he really had to put himself in a position where he made some comments. I mean, at one point, he said to the jury not to focus on the word cult and to say, I don't think that helps you at all, and was referring to Keith Raniere's methods as quote unquote strong medicine, and it didn't work for everyone, and called DAS a social club. And I think to an extent, Nancy's comments in the last episode, there's still a little bit of that coming across of, hey, 17,000 people went to NXIVM, where are they? And I was glad, Casey, I'm sure you have some thoughts on this as well, that really for the first time in the Vow second season, or maybe in the Vow altogether, there was some degree of pushback, in showing Nancy, well, this is what Keith Raniere said, and this is what you said, and to be able to confront her with her own words, as well as the fact that we had, her counselor saying these methods they were used. This is, that's how coerciveness begins. That's how coercion happens. So I was glad to see a little bit of pushback there that had not been there in the past.
But then when Nancy got off the line, she kind of turns to the interviewer and says, sometimes I forget what exactly she said, but the implication was that she sort of agreed with her counselor when she was on the line, but then got off and said, I'm not sure I agree with that. That still in the back of her head, despite everything she has admitted to, the destruction of her family or near destruction of her family, there's still a part of her that still thinks that what she and Keith built together was righteous. My favorite moment, and maybe we can go around the horn and ask for other people's favorite moments, but my favorite moment was when Nancy Salzman's mother said, "I never liked him." that to me was comical, and because basically this is a woman whose daughter and granddaughters were both had their lives or all had their lives wrecked by this man,
To me, the part, I don't know if this is a favorite moment, but I thought one of the parts that to me was most perplexing and hard to figure out is the point where Nancy is in tears for a long period of time. Because we saw the first episode, Nancy shows you how quick she can turn on a dime and put on I don't want to say an act, but in the first episode this year, Nancy went into like a sort of to say, this is how I could react. And then she pulls back and says, see? And so then she's in tears. So you say, are these tears legit? Or is she putting on a show? And I don't want to say that she's not. I really don't. Because I do think to a degree Nancy was a victim of Keith too. I also think it's outweighed by a huge amount of other things. But so to me, there's that whole part. Like how you ask yourself, how much does Nancy Salzman really feel a remorse here? And I don't know the answer to that question, and you can't get it in her head. But I think there's a lot of wanting to hold on and to say, oh, well, not everything that we did was bad. Didn't always come out in last night's episode. But again, there's so much of this case that has nothing to do with DOS and has nothing to do with Keith Raniere's predation of underage kids, and has to do with the quote unquote enemies of NXIVM and in her basement, in boxes in her basement. And there's a photo of Keith Raniere in Nancy's basement, and $515,000 plus in her basement. And, the end of the day, this is a racketeering case.
I just want to jump in here from a filmmaking perspective. Keying into emotions and emotional responses, like the scenes where Nancy's crying, sorting through her feelings. It's very effective on camera, particularly for those viewers who are more empathic. But I think we needed to see Nancy displaying that raw emotion in the moment. And I am willing to believe that it was genuine, despite her skills, as you mentioned, manipulating the emotions of others. But I do think it was important as well to convey to the audience that she was also a victim of Keith Raniere. However, I worry that the unfiltered way that those emotions were allowed to unfold in that crescendo of the series, it runs the risk of burying the fact, in my opinion, that she did indeed commit crimes that she pled guilty to. I think the series was intent on portraying the fact that Nancy and many of those women of NXIVM were victims, and that any of their criminal actions maybe could entirely be chalked up to Raniere's manipulations, which is partly true, but they still committed these crimes. They pled guilty to them. And I think that fact gets a little lost in the climax of emotions that unfolds at the end of this series. Which, if you're not well versed in the world of NXIVM as we are on this podcast, we've been covering it for years, you might not really pick up on that if you're kind of new to this story.
Was there ever a thought of putting Nancy on the stand, or was she seen as being far too compromised because of everything that she had done?
There was a thought at a certain point, and in her sentencing, at her sentencing, it was acknowledged that she had agreed to provide information to the government. By the time we were considering that, I think it was too late. As I've talked about, really, there is a point in time where you have to decide, what is this trial going to look like? And for somebody to be an effective witness on the stand, they do need to be able to take full ownership of everything bad that they had done. So even things that they have not pled guilty to, they need to be able to own. So I just think we had all of the parts that we needed from what Nancy's testimony could be, from other witnesses. So I think we were all pretty quickly in agreement. She did provide certain pieces of curriculum that I do think that highlighted some of these things we've been talking about in terms of abuse of children, that I had not seen before. I mean, we're getting very in the weeds, but in our last, we really bookended that video that I think is so important of Keith Raniere teaching that lesson on, some children not minding abuse, and it doesn't matter whether they're, adult like, and then Nancy actually giving that to the class that has those underage girls in it. That was something we had already, but then there were additional pieces of curriculum that, backed that up. But ultimately, I also think she's and I think we see this in the vow, she's a very difficult person for a jury to relate to. I think that the reality is Lauren was such an important witness for our trial. And I think having Nancy on the stand, one of the things that was a biggest concern to me is that people would really dislike her and really, in some ways, find it difficult to credit her because of the fact that she brought her daughter into this and really encouraged that relationship with Keith Raniere for such a long time, even knowing and having had these experiences with Keith Raniere herself. And she really was instrumental in a lot of the harms that happened. So, going around and EMing Keith Raniere's girlfriends or, partners when he felt that they were out of line, and so much more. So I think it would have been I think there were a lot of potential downsides to putting her on the stand, especially in contrast to Lauren, which I don't think because you're only we heard some of Lauren's testimony in the vow, but I think if you had really heard from Lauren herself in the vow, I think even what sympathy people have for Nancy, I think it's harder to have it if you're hearing from Lauren herself.
It's interesting when I talk to people about Lauren who were at the trial and people who were not at the trial, because she was such a devastating witness, I thought, really just brought people into that world. But I thought, I've said this on other podcasts, that she's one of many people who her first reaction to Keith when she's 19 or 20 is, this guy's weird. It's kind of like Daniela and like Mark Vicente. Like their first experience with NXIVM, their immediate reaction, they should have just followed. It's like, something's off here, because they're very intelligent, and whatever reason they like anybody can get sucked into these things. What I thought was interesting is that this didn't come out of the vow at all, is that at the Nancy's sentencing, there were some allegations, there was some talk that Nancy, even in the months before she was sentenced, was engaging in some kind of EMing. And obviously she didn't say that she was. And, the judge was very clear to say he didn't want that to be the case. So, that's something, if she had testified to, there's always this idea of could Keith's attorneys have just basically put it all on her and said, this is all on Nancy. I mean, I do think it was interesting that he said, we went around and we got all these people all over the world, but nobody would come forth. So when you sit there and you say 17,000 people went through this organization, where are they? Well, if it wasn't what it was, I mean, if it was so great an experience for all these people. For one thing, you wouldn't be speaking on HBO, and you wouldn't be having this discussion, because obviously if they could have put someone on the witness stand to help exonerate Keith, they would have. To me, it kind of speaks for itself. But I did think that was interesting, that the talk of Nancy's potential EMing never came up at the very end.
Maybe sort of one last question to kind of wind it up. And we really appreciate your taking the time. And I just wanted to put the question to you as to whether or not there is an element of this case. And I think you might have mentioned this in previous interviews, that if the story of NXIVM and Keith Raniere is the construction of an elaborate mechanism for the abuse, the exploitation of women, that it is significant that women, the testimony of women, the fact that the lead prosecutor was a woman, is a woman, and the fact that this prosecution really did correspond with the Me Too movement. I think it was just a couple of weeks before the Times broke the Harvey Weinstein story that they broke the story of what was going on in DOS. That so much of the kind of reckoning over sexual harassment, sexual abuse that this country has been through over the course of the last 5 years ago, maybe it's even this month, seems to be part and parcel of the story of the downfall of NXIVM.
I think that's right. Hashtag Me Too, I actually think was within days of the New York Times article breaking. So I do think there was a societal discussion that was happening about coercive control, about the ways in which men who are abusing power have often used women as tools to groom and victimize other women. So I think that was something that was definitely in the discourse. That being said, I don't believe that is why we got a conviction. I think that it was very clear that all of the elements of the crimes had been met. And that was certainly, we tried to be very mindful of the fact that we wanted this case and this trial to be about the evidence that is directly related to the crimes. I will say, one of the witnesses who was not talked about on the vow was, we did have an expert on coercive control who didn't talk about the specific facts of the case, but gave an overview about counterintuitive victim behavior, about abuses of power, about the ways in which, when not just in a cult-like group, but in any abusive relationship, when you have isolated people, when you are taking away kind of this basic human agency, where they can be at any time, what they can eat, all of those things, how those work to really make somebody very vulnerable to abuse and manipulation. And so, I just can't say whether a jury would be more open to hearing those things than they would have been, a couple years prior. But really, this case was not a Me Too case, or certainly that wasn't how I saw it. But I think these are real societal issues, some of which did come up in the case, in terms of men who are in a position of authority and are using other women to really carry out the crimes. And then I think people began to recognize that more after we did the NXIVM trial. So I think a lot of the way, the Ghislaine Maxwell trial ended up looking, or the way that was being talked about, had a lot of similar elements to having kind of this inner circle of women, or a top woman kind of doing the bidding for this predator. And that's not to say that the other women who are doing that aren't themselves abused or victims in some way, but that's true of every criminal organization. I mean, when you're talking about a gang case, when you're talking about a mafia case, there is always a level of victimization, or I should say, almost always a level of victimization in people who end up committing crimes. So I think it's important to recognize that too, which is a really hard, I think it's one of the hardest aspects of being a prosecutor and really having that discretion to figure out where is the line. And in terms of having, my being one of the, me being a woman and being the lead prosecutor, I think a lot of people got a lot of satisfaction out of that. And I was hugely invested in the case. And of course, Tanya Hajar as well, who tried the case with me. People, I think, got satisfaction out of that too. And I think there are ways in which that was important. But I always like to say we had really, really great men on our team too, including our FBI agents who, came in with a really healthy skepticism. That's their job. But invested so quickly in this case and meeting with the victims and in really, I can tell you, I don't think any of them are like #MeToo people. And they were, that was not why they were bringing this case and working on this case with me. And they really questioned everything. And it was just abundantly clear that these horrible crimes had in fact been committed.
That is a perfect summation to both this episode and this series, and maybe to the NXIVM on Trial podcast. Unless something completely bizarre happens, this very well could be our final episode, but we shall see.
I feel like I've heard you say that before, Casey. I can probably track the episode where you said that before.
Yes, there is definitely an Al Pacino Godfather 3 vibe.
Like I say, and ever you expect who have seen the strangest part of the NXIVM case, it always gets stranger. So there's always that.
Interesting. All right. Well, listen, thanks very much to Moira Penza. We really appreciate your taking the time. It's been great talking with you, and happy Thanksgiving. And for the Times-Union, I am Casey Seiler, editor-in-chief.
I'm Jessica Marshall, multimedia producer and producer of NXIVM on Trial.
I'm Rob Gavin, Times-Union Cops Courts reporter who covered the NXIVM trial.
Thanks for listening, and please remember to support local journalism.
It's been 15 years since 12-year-old Shalik Rainwalker vanished. His disappearance from rural upstate New York was ruled a probable child homicide. But no one has ever been charged, and his body has never been found. This is Rainwalker, the Lost Boy. I'm Jessica Marshall.
And I'm Wendy Libertor.
In this podcast from the Times-Union, we'll take a deep dive into this mystery, the case of a missing child that has unsettled New York's capital region and beyond for more than a decade.
Coming soon, wherever you listen to podcasts.